Good morning. It's Maundy Thursday, and we are now firmly in the holiest days of the year. So we will keep the news portion of this. There is news, and so we'll talk the news, and then we're going to go to Bishop Athanasius Schneider for his. No, he's not joining me on the show, but we will have his um, Maundy Thursday, his Holy Week reflection here. Quick prayer request. Today is my non-believing younger brother's birthday. So if you could please say a prayer for his that his heart will be softened towards the faith and he will have a conversion, because he doesn't have any, and it would be obviously greatly appreciated if you would keep him in your prayer intentions. And so on the Cardinal's Facebook, Cardinal Grech, who is the one of the co-chairs of the Synod on Synodality, he released his answers to an interview or a series of questions he received about the synod, and his answers are eye-opening, to say the least. We're just going to focus on one of them here today. He was asked. He basically let us know that what we need to do is rethink Catholicism. The synodality, as a process, is forcing us to rethink everything about the Catholic faith. Everything. Again, folks, people don't like it when we say it's a new religion. We get accused of leading people astray and saying all sorts of evil things, but it's a new religion. And it's not just the Synod, it's Vatican II. He admits it himself here. So he published a lot of this stuff. Again, he published this all on Facebook, on his own public Facebook here. As you can see, I'll just highlight this so I can not lose my place. This is Cardinal Mario Grech, published this 2 days ago. And the first question he's asked is, it's up here at the top, and it takes a long time to actually get to an answer. So that's why I'm going to just go back down there, make this a little bigger for those of you who wish to follow along at home. Again, Cardinal Mario Grech. By the way, co-chairing the Synod on Synodality does make you, at least on paper, more likely to become the next pope. More likely. That doesn't mean he's a guarantee. I'm not saying Mario Grech is the next pope, but he's definitely, his popability has gotten a boost from this, because it means that he can handle things like running an ecumenical council, for example. He and Cardinal Hollerich, the other person that I think is a sleeper candidate. But here's the basically, it's less of a question, more of a statement that he got from a theology professor. And the question he received is, the synodal process is a learning path for the Roman Catholic Church to incorporate the insights of all its members as it seeks and experiments with ways forward into an as yet unknown future. However, official church regulations on doctrine, law, and practice leave little room for maneuver in many respects. Moreover, in Catholic mentalities, innovation can only often prevail if it can be presented as continuity. From a theological perspective, we would like to suggest that, together with synodality, it is also necessary to learn how to deal with the development of doctrine and practice in a historically informed and critically self-reflective way. So that's a question he got. It's not really a question, it's a statement. He's going to answer this. So let's go to do this in plain English. The synodal process essentially has allowed the church to bring in all the ideas and insights of the members as it just decides to change and play around with new ways of being church, as the more plain language synod leaders have used in the recent past. And we don't know where this is taking us. However, often the church's deposit of the faith, regulations on doctrine, canon law, and its practice of the faith leave little room to experiment with how to change how to be church in the future. Moreover, in the Catholic way of thinking, these new things can often only be doable if they are identifiably Catholic, and we can see where they came from in the history of the faith. So, from a theological perspective, we would suggest, together with synodality, that we need to really address this continuity idea and this practice and how we practice the faith today and reassess them. That's essentially what this theology professor is saying, who's apparently very sold on synodality because they really like the idea of an inclusive church. Here is what Cardinal Grech has to say on this. It's a long answer, so I'm not going over the whole painful thing. Maybe some more tomorrow, although I'm hoping today we get something from Vigano or Cardinal Burke or something that we can have a a Good Friday live stream that's actually like focused on the faith more and on Good Friday than on news, but we'll see what the day brings us. Cardinal Grech's answer here is revealing. He says it's time to rethink Catholicism. I'm glad they're letting us know that this is what they're doing. But you'll see why they're getting away with saying this because of just how it's worded. So here's what he says, quote, "First of all, thank you for this suggestion. I too am convinced that without an adequate theological foundation, synodality would soon end up emptying itself without affecting the life of the church. I am thinking of those sociological interpretations of synodality, which set the people of God against the pastors, fueling the oppositions and divisions that weaken the ecclesial body. This leads me to say that there is a need not only for doctrine, but for good doctrine. Even ideological readings claim the character of theological interpretation." That means when he's saying whenever you see them use the word ideological claims, like ideological, that's a nice way of saying people who are against what we're doing. Right? So people who are against what we're doing claim the character of theological interpretation. Perish the thought that we might say, hey, the church never did this before. What are you doing? But let's keep going. It seems to me that a developing theology of synodality is capable of grasping the complexity of the theme and its practice. I am convinced that the synodal processes we are currently experiencing constitutes the mature form of the reception of Vatican II, showing how it is possible to translate into practice the ecclesiological horizon proposed by the Second Vatican Council, welding together synodality, collegiality, and primacy in dynamic unity. To do this, we must continue to theologically deepen synodality, study all its aspects, see its implications, reestablish all the connections that a suspension of synodal praxis has obscured and weakened. The first session of the assembly delivered this need for in-depth study to the whole church, at the very moment in which, for each theme of the synthesis report, it did not only indicate the consensus of the assembly, but the aspects to be studied in depth and the proposals to be implemented. The bishops' conferences were invited to involve the theology study centers in their region to deepen the themes of synodality. The Secretariat of the Synod is activating with the dicasteries of the Roman Curia 10 study commissions on the topic that will not be dealt with at the October Assembly, and 5 commissions of experts to delve into theological topics in preparation for the second session of the Synod. And here he's talking about how they've got some working groups that are going to continue after this fall, so the Synod doesn't end in 2024 like we all really hoped it would. They extended it again. They now got working groups going on into next year, 2025. I like to emphasize that the theological dimension is inherent to synodality. From the experience we're living, it is becoming increasingly clear that the synodal process is all the more conscious and participatory the more it is supported by clear and shared doctrine. And that it is precisely doctrine that opens up the way for thinking for church official regulations on doctrine, law, and practice. In this regard, I can say that we have asked the Holy Father to set up a group of canonists to make proposals on how to rethink church discipline in a synodal way. There's your first really alarming sign, to rethink church discipline in a synodal way. This is you're touching now clerical celibacy, deaconettes, who can receive the Eucharist, under what conditions, church discipline. It is clear that once it is understood that the church is constitutively synodal, everything must be rethought in this perspective. Everything must be rethought in this perspective. Everything. That's a rather large umbrella. Doctrine, dogma, everything about the church. This is why the need for a fruitful dialogue between theology, especially ecclesiology being the theology of what the church is, and the law is increasingly emerging. I therefore agree with the suggestions to, quote, learn to approach the development of doctrine and practice in a historically informed and critically self-reflective manner, has an element supporting synodal praxis, but it seems to me that this requirement is internal to the synod process itself, especially if incorporating the insights of all its members as the church seeks and experiments with ways forward into an as yet unknown future. Means listening to the spirit who guides the church. Which spirit is it that's guiding the synod, Cardinal? I'd really like to know. At stake in the synodal process is the sensus fide of God's holy people who participate in the prophetic function of Christ and are an infallible incredendo. This is why I would go beyond the question of continuity, end quote. Going beyond the question of continuity means he's not that concerned if it aligns up with what was identifiably Catholic before. The question of continuity. Let's go beyond that. The purpose of the Synod of Synodality has been the process to bring the laity in, so the laity are used to participating in church functions that have nothing to do with what authority laity have, which is extremely limited anyway, and to bring them into discussions about things that are well beyond our purview, hardcore matters of doctrine and yes, dogma. They have said they want to bring laity into decision-making processes of this moving forward. We've seen some of this already with Francis appointing laymen to head up dicasteries. We see this in dioceses where there are now laity managing parishes in the absence of priests. This is synodality. This is the democratization of the church. From there, you can get your deaconettes, you can get your priestesses, you can get your James Martin blessings all you want from there, because it's going to be the laity, the worst catechized generations in history, making these decisions moving forward. It'll be their, quote, sensus fide, determining the truth of the faith. But beyond all that, there's actually a bit of error, condemned error anyway, in what he has to say. I've brought you this article before. It's been a while. This comes from the Unum Sanctum Catholicum blog. And the article is, what is archaeologism? If you're not familiar with archaeologism, it's this claim of, well, the ancient church, the early church did this, so we should go back to doing it. There is a right-ordered development of practice and development of doctrine. And archaeologism flips that on its head and says, the things that had developed over time were not good, and we should go back to the way the church did them in the early days, disregarding the fact that it was with the church's authority that things changed slowly over time, as opposed to sudden changes when you get a bunch of suspected heretics at a weird, unique council that's not ecumenical but pastoral, whatever that means, deciding that they're going to take a council over and implement things that were overtly condemned by the church. Let's not get confused here. But what you're seeing on display, there's this concept of critical theology and archaeologism. So critical theology, if you see the word critical in front of any area of social science or classical liberal arts kinds of studies, the word critical in front of it means go in and, be critical of everything you've seen before. So like literature, example, critical literature would be to say, well, these are all these books are written by a bunch of old white guys who are all gone now, so let's not bother reading it, because all they were doing was fill in the blank problems that you see people complain about in the culture. It's these guys' fault. That's all they were doing, right? It's all they're part of the problem. Critical theology is looking at the theology of the church and seeing where you can change it for the better. That's what critical theology really functionally means. Yeah, it's been condemned. Condemned by the church. Critical studies in general were condemned by the church. But you also see archaeologism. And so this Unum Sanctum article gives us a good... I'm not going to go over the whole thing, obviously, because we've got, Bishop Schneider's piece to get to. But archaeologism. It says in his 1947 encyclical Mediator Dei, Venerable Pius XII warned against what he termed an exaggerated and senseless antiquarianism in the form of the sacred liturgy. This preference for antiquarianism has subsequently been known as archaeologism, and from the 1930s till today has been one of the most prevalent schools of thought and discussions about Catholic identity. What is archaeologism? Why is it so prevalent? And why did Pope Pius XII warn Catholics against it? How does it promote a distorted view of Catholic tradition? And then he goes over in a lot of detail. Most of the time you hear about archaeologism, it has to do with the liturgy. Remember, the new mass was sold to people by saying, well, this is how the ancient church worshipped. This is really closer to what they did. And so we should get back to it. That's where you often see these archaeologism sort of claims. The first century church, first century Christians had communion in the hand. No, they didn't. They didn't have communion in the hand. One father of the church detailed communion in the hand. A whole lot of other fathers of the church condemned it. So there was not exactly communion in the hand in the early church, but you saw a lot of archaeological claims being made about the early church in the sort of so-called reform of the liturgy that came later. And the whole argument, the whole basis of thinking that they use is condemned by Pius XII in Mediator Dei. And it was in 1947, 23 years before we got the liturgical reform that he was trying to forestall. But archaeologism is not so much a heresy as a fad, says this article, a certain approach to Catholic liturgy and practice. Its distinguishing characteristic is an excessive value placed on those Catholic practices which came earlier in historical chronological succession, where the archaeologist first is always best. A practice or prayer of the patristic church is better or purer than a practice of the medieval church. Consequently, the goal of any true liturgical renewal ought to be to return to the practice of the first Christians in as much as possible. The modern church ought to imitate the apostolic church. That's archaeologism summed up. And we've seen this said about synodality. The early church was synodal in nature, so we should be synodal in nature too. You see this, they use the Eastern Orthodox as their example, which is odd. I don't know why they keep doing this, but because they use them because the Eastern Orthodox claim that, or the general belief is they've changed very little about how they do things going back to their schism. But what they're doing in Rome is not the synodality of the East. They're not putting, the Eastern Orthodox aren't, rethinking their theology. Okay, they're not putting laity in charge of who gets to do basic church functions. That's not what they're doing. But the article goes on, it says the origin of archaeologism lay in the liturgical movement in the 1930s. If you ever read Work of Human Hands by the Sedevacantist priest Father Anthony Cicada, I'm not a Sedevacantist, but his book, Work of Human Hands, is widely considered the best and most brutal critique of the new Mass. And theologians have looked at it and said, yeah, he's not wrong, anything he says here. So it's considered like one of the best works on it ever written. He really proves what this article is saying is true. Where he talks about the liturgical movements going back with, these are known heretics doing this stuff. And they're making all archaeological claims about, the ancient church did X, the ancient church did Y. We need to be doing this too. Right. And so you see this in Cardinal Grech's statement. And in fact, you see the same thing, this archaeological statement being made throughout this whole synodal process. And again, that's the root of what they're doing. They're not making any really sound claims here. And their whole point is that we need to rethink everything about Catholicism. Now he's just openly saying it. And this is an odd thing to do to me because a lot of people seem to think we're heading towards a conclave soon. There'd be a new pope. Maybe the last thing you want to tell people, if you're on that list of people who could make the case that you should be pope, and you're relatively young, so you could be there for a while, like Cardinal Grech is, maybe the last thing you want to tell the moderates are going to be the ones deciding all this, that, hey, maybe we should rethink everything. As Small Rail said, gives important context about the early liturgy. Once peace arrived, meaning the church was able to not be underground anymore, the early Christians wanted more pomp, beauty, and fuller liturgy, and organic development for the glory of God. Precisely true. But now, as our cleanser for all that bizarre stuff, we will go now to this, which was published by Info Vaticana yesterday. By his stripes we were healed, the triumph of redemptive love in the current crisis of the church, by Bishop Athanasius Schneider. Don't know if this is new, because Bishop Schneider deleted all of his social media. But this was published yesterday, and Info Vaticana does good work, so I'm going to trust them here. It says, why was our Lord and Savior wounded? He was wounded for the sins of men, for the sins of all men, for the first sin of Adam and Eve, for the sins of each one of us, for every serious sin of my life. Christ was wounded because he himself wanted it. Why did he want it? Because he infinitely loves each person, each sinner. The suffering of Christ is the greatest revelation of God's love for humanity. From each wound of Christ from his holy cross, these words resonate. Look how much I have loved men. Look how much I loved you personally. St. Francis de Sales said, nothing moves the heart of man as much as love. If a man knows that he is loved, no matter who he is forced to reciprocate the love. But if the one who loves him is a great monarch, how much more pressure does he feel? And now, knowing that Jesus Christ, true eternal and omnipotent God, has loved us to the point of wanting to suffer death for us, and the death on a cross, is not all this equivalent to having our hearts as if in a vice, so that the love with a force and violence that is all the more irresistible as it is kinder and more pleasant? What follows from this is what Christ desired of us, that we be conformed to him, so that, as the apostle says, those who live may no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and was resurrected for them. Oh my God, how strong is this consequence in matters of love? Jesus Christ died for us. He gave us life with his death. We do not live, but because he died. Our life, therefore, is not ours, but that of him who acquired it for us with his death. Therefore, we must no longer live in ourselves, but in him, not for us, but for God. Let us consecrate to the divine love with which our Savior died all the moments of our lives, referring to his glory, all our undertakings, all our conquests, all our works, all our actions, all our thoughts, all our affections. Let us contemplate this divine Redeemer lying on the cross on which he dies of love for us. Why don't we throw ourselves in spirit on him, to die on the cross with him, who also wanted to die for our love? I will cling to him. We should say, if we had generosity, I will die with him, and I will burn myself in the same flames of his love. The same fire will consume this divine creator and his base creature. My Jesus is all mine, and I am all his. See the Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 16, or the Song of Solomon, probably, chapter 2, verse 16. And I will live and die on his breast. Neither death nor life will ever separate me from him. The passion of the Lord in his holy cross contains and radiates the omnipotence of divine love. Only this redeeming love overcomes sin, all selfishness, and all the power of Satan. This redemptive love has the greatest transformative power. The wounds of Christ radiate the greatest spiritual beauty. The Passion of Christ is the most sublime act of the glorification of God and contains within itself all the splendor of supernatural beauty. Jesus himself spoke thus of his sacrifice on the cross. Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, deliver me from this hour. But if for this reason I have come, for this hour, Father, glorify your name. Then a voice rang from heaven. I have glorified him, and I will glorify him again. Speaking of the passion of Christ, St. Augustine said, let us love the bridegroom. The more deformed he appears to us, the more splendid, the sweeter he becomes to his wife. In the Christ who suffers on the cross, we find the treasures of spiritual beauty. As St. Bonaventure stated, your heart, O good Jesus, is the rich treasure, the precious pearl that we have discovered in your wounded body, as in a dug field. We can ask, why salvation through redemption? St. Thomas Aquinas said that if the human being were simply saved, he would not have been redeemed, because redemption entails sufficient satisfaction. Christ adequately atones for an offense and offers something that God, who is offended by the offense, loves equally or even more than the offense. By suffering out of love and obedience, Christ gave God more than was necessary to compensate for the offense of the entire human race. Why such suffering of Christ? Why did Christ's redemptive suffering have to be so terrible? To this there is no other answer than his love. To fully embrace humanity, he wanted to descend to the very depths of his tragedy. He did not come in this first parousia to eliminate our anguish, but to assume it and illuminate it. He took it entirely upon himself. He was tested in every way according to his likeness to us except sin. God, writes St. Paul, proves his love for us in that, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Christ, St. John writes, he loved us and washed us from our sins in his blood. He himself has said, greater love has no one than to lay down one's life for his friends. How could we have assumed in God such concern, such need for our salvation? It is before the abyss of Jesus' agony that we begin to guess what God's love for us is. The passion of Christ, which saved the world lost from the first sin and established a universe of redemption, is inextricably sacrifice and an act of love. a sacrifice, an external act of worship, a liturgy, but one that involves the purest and most intense love that has ever flowed from a human heart. An act of love, but wrapped in a voluntary sacrifice, an external act of worship, a liturgy. The church sings to the love priest by immolating his holy body. Almique membere corporis amore secudos immolat. The days of Holy Week once again bring before the eyes of our faith the central truth. We are saved by the holy wounds on the cross of our Lord and God. We have been redeemed and made children of God for the love of Christ. God not only created us out of love, but also redeemed us with an even greater and ineffable love. A Christian is a person of the cross of Christ, who conquers all evil. Let us therefore embrace the cross of Christ with faith, love, and great gratitude. Let us never deny the cross of Christ. Let us unite all our great and small sufferings and crosses of our lives with the victory of the cross of Christ. Then we will receive the power of love, and all our crosses will have redemptive and eternal value. The cross of Christ already contains within itself the victory and light of the resurrection. Through the wood of the cross, joy reached the entire world, sings the church in the sacred liturgy. In our time, the entire church is experiencing agonizing and heavy hours under the cross. Our Holy Mother Church is beaten and humiliated by her enemies, who are within the church and have sometimes even occupied influential positions. But the more the darkness of the church's passion increases, the more certain is its victory. The more certain is the arrival of the light of Christ's triumph into the life of the entire church. The current wounds in the life of the church will bring renewed spiritual life. We believe this because there is no salvation or light without the wounds of Christ, because there is no salvation or light without our personal connection with the wounds and cross of Christ, because there is no light or spiritual spring for the church without the participation of all the church in the mystery of the cross of Christ. The current profound crisis of the church will also be transformed into a new era of the saints, and there are already saints in the life of the church today, primarily little saints, hidden saints, such as child saints, young saints, seminarian saints, holy fathers and mothers of families, contemplative religious saints, men and women. These little saints are preparing the ground for an era of holy bishops and holy popes. Each one of us should glory in the cross of Christ. The entire church is adorned with the cross of Christ, not only externally in its buildings, but in its life. Yes, by the wounds of Christ we are healed, by his vicious wounds, by the victory of his redeeming love. Signed by Athanasius Schneider, Auxiliary Bishop of the Archdiocese of Mary Most Holy in Astana. And that is Bishop Schneider's Holy Week message. I'm going to wrap this up here in a moment. I think Bishop Schneider's the best of the bishops right now. I would practically do cartwheels if he walked out on that loggia, even though he's not a cardinal, so his chances of being his chance of getting elected pope are zero. But because they always choose a cardinal. But if it happened, I would practically do cartwheels, which would be a miracle in itself if I could pull it off. All right, folks. If there's any final thoughts on this, his reflection is also a good foil almost to what we were seeing with Cardinal Grech. You get an unabashedly Catholic message from Bishop Schneider, and then Cardinal Grech giving us all sorts of weird ideas for what the church should be doing moving forward with synodality. Laura says Bishop Schneider is such a holy man. He radiates that peace that you associate with saintly types. Vivian Rodriguez is suggesting that people should listen to Father Gregory Hess. He'll challenge you. If you are a believer that the problems in the church right now are Francis, he's going to challenge you very greatly. And there are some who don't like Father Hess because they claim that there's problems with his theology. Not my place to say. I do like Father Hess, though. Archbishop Vigano would refer to Grech as a non-Catholic actor in the church. He very much would, yes. I'm hoping that we get a message from Vigano today. That would be good. But, yes, I'll be back tomorrow for a news video at the very least, though. All right, folks. Thanks very much for tuning in today. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.